Hi again, everybody. Welcome to an all-new edition of No Holding Back. Ben Holden with you. Freddie Pletsch on the left. Freddie, how are you?
I'm great. I've got a little change today. Got the hat on, and my wife has rejoined me after 6 weeks in Palm Springs and 2 weeks in quarantine. So she might.
You wishing she stayed, or is everything good?
She's staying so far.
Our guest today is Brad Schlossman, longtime writer at the Grand Forks Herald. Brad, how are you, man?
I'm doing well too. Beautiful day in Grand Forks, so I'll take it.
What's the temp?
It's probably in the 50s, which probably isn't great for you guys, but it's sunny out. We take what we can get.
Yeah, it's the same here. It's we must have got the same front that moved through here, so it's finally warming up and getting sunny out, which is great for all of us. So Brad, appreciate your time, man. We've known each other since the league started. That was the first time you and I'd ever met. I know you and Fred have met before in the past. And, one of the things that we've been doing with a lot of these, whether it's been a coach, a player, a guy like yourself, an outstanding writer covering the great sport of college hockey, is kind of go like point A to point B, so to speak. And, we've talked plenty of times. But I really don't know how you got into what you're doing today. You started at the paper, correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2003, and you've been covering the hockey beat since 2005. So how did you get into this wide world of sports and hockey specifically, Brad?
Yeah, I guess for starters, I remember I always tell people the story of when I was in high school. I hated math and science. It wasn't my thing. I always loved sports. I played a lot of different sports, and I followed just about every sport there was in my spare time. And I would always do my homework while listening to sports radio. And one night a caller called in and said, he's sick and tired of athletes complaining all the time. They have the best job in the world, and all they do is complain. And the radio host said, well, some people think we have the best job in the world. All we do is sit around all day and talk about sports. And I was like, man, he's kind of right. That would be a really good job to have. And so I looked into sports journalism. I enrolled in the next semester in high school, and I started going into it in college. I had an internship at the paper one summer in 2003 and absolutely loved the newspaper. I loved the atmosphere of a newsroom. I love the pursuit of stories. It's kind of like competing in a sport to chase stories. So I love the competition. I love the attention to detail that really good newsrooms have. And it just, the second I did that internship, I was like, this is what I want to do. And so the first couple years I did part-time stuff. I covered a lot of high school games. I happened to come along at a great time. The World Juniors were in Grand Forks, so I got put on the World Juniors. I've got a lot of fun memories from that. I went into small town news for a little bit, and then in about September of 2005, the guy who covered UND hockey before me retired, and he had been doing it for 36 years. And they said, hey, you come over and start doing this. We need someone on this right now. And I've just kind of been doing it ever since. So I actually never applied for the job. I just started doing it, and they haven't told me to stop yet. So
I can relate. I mean, the competition part, I can really relate. It's obviously a little different for me, and Freddie's been in the broadcast business for a lot of years as well. But I can relate going back to my years in news as a television reporter and anchor. The competition part, you want to beat the competition and, win it and all that. So I get that part. So you mentioned the man that you stepped in for. And Virg is still around, man. I see him at every game I'm there for. Obviously, you're at every single game North Dakota plays. What kind of impact did Virg have on you and still does today, Brad?
Yeah, that's one of that is the biggest advantage I've had is having Virg. He's just an unbelievable guy. Like, everyone knows how renowned of a reporter he is. Like, that's well known across the country, but nobody knows how good of a person he is too. Like, he's helped me out from day one until to this day. I talked to him last night. We talked about draft picks from North Dakota. He's the state of North Dakota for high school hockey. So he's just always been there. He's always been super supportive. My first year on the beat, every time someone new came into the press box, he would introduce me to them. He just went way out of his way to help me out, and still to this day does. And just not many people have an advantage of a guy who knows everyone and has such a good background and is such a good writer, constantly helping you out with building relationships, working on your skills as a writer, and having historical background of information. It's unbelievable what he's done and how he supports a lot of people working to get into the business.
That's great. Freddie?
Piqued my curiosity, Brad, with that reference to the World Juniors. And such a great event. Was that the Jack Johnson and Jonathan Taves shootout World Juniors?
No, it was the year before. So it was actually the best year to possibly have the World Juniors. There was the NHL lockout. So here's Canada's team. They had Sidney Crosby, Patrice Bergeron, Shea Weber, Brent Seabrook, Dion Phaneuf, Getzlaff, Perry, Richards. It was unbelievable. Russia had Malkin and Ovechkin. So it was everyone played. Ovechkin never would have played in that World Juniors if there wasn't the lockout. But of course there's a lockout, so he played in it. I just was remembering this with someone not too long ago, but it was in Grand Forks and Thief River Falls. Thief was the second location. Since I was the young guy, they sent me over to Thief for the first week. Grand Forks had an unbelievable media contingent there because there's no NHL. So what are you going to do? And this is back when newspapers were sending everyone everywhere. So all these newspapers in Canada had 2-3 guys there. They turned the Olympic rink at the Ralph into a media room, and it was, hundreds. I remember when they would go through the mixed area, it was just a battle to get your recorder in position to, hear the guy talking. Nobody went to Thief River Falls. So I am the only person there. And right away I got there and they're like, yeah, there's not a lot of room downstairs, so we don't want you coming down there for interviews. I'm like, well, how am I supposed to do them? They're like, well, they'll come up to the press box. I'm like, oh, this is amazing. I love it. The game would end and I'd sit there typing my story and just work on it. And, Ovechkin would walk up, he'd pull up a chair and he'd sit right down next to me. I'd talk to him for 5-10 minutes, get everything I needed. And then he'd go back and he'd kind of eat his post-game meal right there, chatting with me. I'm like, yeah, his interviews have probably been a little bit different since then. But I just thought it was hilarious that I was the only guy there. And, Russia played there 3 times. So, he kind of got used to the drill. He'd just walk up there and pull up that seat next to me. So that was kind of a fun memory that I had from that.
Freddie, go ahead. Feel free.
Just wondering, with all the Canadian fans, they came down from Winnipeg, and that always made for a great atmosphere. And where the World Juniors, I think, have been most successful in this country are the border towns. So, Grand Forks not a border town, but something from Manitoba, but 2-hour drives like driving 5 minutes for coffee anywhere else, right?
Yes, it's 1 hour to the border, and it's not much. Sometimes I go up and they'll cover Winnipeg games, and I drive up there and drive home right after the game, and get home at a decent time. But yeah, I thought that was kind of the first World Junior where that theory was, wow, this really works well if it's a border town. Because I think before Grand Forks, the only ones that had hosted were Anchorage, Minneapolis, and Boston. And I don't think any of them had the success that Grand Forks did. And since then, they've been really conscientious about putting it really close to the border. And I think that's something that'll continue. However, maybe at some point Minneapolis will get another one here now that the event is growing a bit. But I think Grand Forks was the first one where they said, wow, like you can get a ton of Canadian fans that come down. Because like you said, the Canada games were just insane. There's so many Canadian fans that came down and they were so into it. And as much as UND has had some crazy atmosphere, I think UND fans took a few things from the Canadian fans in that tournament and have brought it to making the atmosphere in the Ralph what it is.
Well, before we talk about all the great players that come through, let's talk about those fans. I mean, they are as passionate as any group of fans. I'd say not just college hockey, but hockey. Has that kind of been passed down through the generations, or is it more recent experience?
Yeah, I think so. Like even back at the old Ralph, you had some crazy fans there, and it was a wild atmosphere. And I think there are a few things that have led into it. Number one, UND's been so traditionally successful year after year after year that people gravitate toward good teams. And if they had one good team every 8 years, it might be hard to keep these people consistently on board, but they've been so consistently good that they've stayed on board. And another big factor is there are no pro teams of any sport within 3 hours of Grand Forks, which would be Winnipeg is the closest, and they just came back recently. But this is the pro team in North Dakota. So this is the team everyone follows. And on campus, a lot of campuses, the football team is number one, and then you get into basketball and hockey. In Grand Forks, hockey's number one. And so a lot of these fans, that's what they remember going to, these hockey games and having a great time. And so almost everyone who graduates from UND ends up moving around the country. But they still pay attention and follow really closely. So anytime UND plays, and Ben's seen it out in Denver, how many UND fans are at those games, because so many live in Colorado that, hey, when UND's out there, they take that chance to go see them. So they've really created this fan base, I think, through the continued success, the fact that there aren't pro sports in North Dakota, and that's what people remember from their on-campus experience.
Yeah, Brad Schlossman joining us from the Grand Forks Herald here on this episode of No Holding Back. So let's talk a little bit about this year, Brad. Obviously, everyone's well aware. You speak of the great – I mean, I've said this for years, and and Fred knows, and those that know me, I'm in 8 different sports a year, right? Mm-hmm. The 2 fan bases that I have found that are the most passionate, hands down, are obviously North Dakota, number 1, I would say. Number 2, this might surprise you a little bit, VCU basketball. They are very similar in the sense that, and I don't know why it is with VCU. I get it, like you said, Brad, with, there's no team within 3 hours in the state, so to speak. But they are very, very similar in that way. So let's talk about, give me your thoughts on this past season, the year they had, and the great job by Brad and his staff, and obviously the players doing what they did. What were your biggest takeaways from the season that this year's team had?
Yeah, it was one of those years where after the previous year where things just did not go right for them, they were out shooting teams by double digits on a regular basis and could not score. I think they lost 11 games where they outshot their opponent by double digits the previous year. So you kind of knew that they weren't far away. I definitely did not see coming what happened, though. I mean, they just seemed to have for when they got in close games, they found ways to win. They won 4 overtime games this year. And the other thing that was interesting to me was I think this carried over from the previous year. But because they had to scratch and claw for everything that previous year, they got used to playing 100%, 60 minutes. They could have no letdowns because their margin for error was so small. And no matter how many setbacks they had that previous year, they never slowed down. They never came to a game where they didn't bring it. And I thought that was interesting. Like, usually when things don't go your way, you'll have some guys taper off and question what's going on. They consistently brought it for 60 minutes every game, and it just didn't go their way, but they never changed how they played. Well, now this year, when things started going their way, that's how they knew how to play. So if they got up 4-0 on a team, they didn't change the way they played. And so you saw some really ugly scores. I mean, they beat teams at 8-1, 7-0. They beat Minnesota, what was it, 9-2, 9-3 out in Mariucci. Yeah. And I think that was a product of the previous year where they only know how to play one way. And I think that led to some lopsided scores, and in close games, they just kept playing the way they always did. And I think that the previous year led into that, and they just had a little bit more offense, adding in Weston Machad, getting Shane Pinto, and having, I think the other key is you usually want like 2-3 guys to take a nice little step. They had like 8 guys take steps. I've never seen that many. So I think it was a combination of adding some pieces and guys taking steps and building from what happened the previous year.
Is that something, Brad, that when you grew up watching this team, it was kind of like high octane Montreal Canadiens, Firewagon hockey, and that hasn't changed, especially now? I mean, that's real important to recruits who go to play a fun brand of hockey, right?
Yeah. I think there are some subtle changes from the late 90s days from Dean Blaze, just in hockey as a whole. But this team, what hasn't changed is I still think they want to play an attacking style. They want to be in your face. They want to force a lot of turnovers. And that has continued from, Gino Gasparini to Dean Blaze to Dave Haxtell to Brad Berry. That style of play just is one thing that really hasn't changed. And I think you're right. I think recruits want to play a fun style of hockey. They want to score goals. They want to play entertaining games. And I think that'll help teams recruit.
On that note, this obviously things have changed in so many ways for all of us, Brad, as we know, with what's going on in the world today, and will probably continue for a while here. But one thing that hasn't changed is all the stuff you're covering, and you mentioned some of the recruits. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the big things you've been covering in terms of that here in the last few months, and really since this has all started?
Well, one big thing about recruiting, especially with Brad Berry at the helm, they've had really good defensive groups. Like, when you look at the defensemen that have come through here, that really has been, I think, the backbone of this team. And last year, as much as we've talked about all these forwards and stuff, I mean, their D-core was fantastic, and I think that's where it starts. And that is going to continue here. They have 3 guys coming in who could go in the top 60 in the draft. Jake Sanderson, he's Jeff Sanderson's son, really good skating defenseman. He can kind of do it all. He's a pretty polished player, and he's going to potentially go in the top 10 of the draft this year. So he'll be coming in. Then you've got Mitchell Miller. He's got a little bit of Christian Wolanin in him. He's a guy who was a forward until recently, converted to defense, and is really dynamic on the back end. And then you've got Tyler Clevin from Fargo coming in, and Tyler Clevin's a throwback. He's a guy who's going to be probably UND's physical defenseman since Andrew McWilliam. And he can, I remember watching him in high school. He played his sophomore year in high school, and here's this kid. He's thin as a rail. He's got this baby face and looks really young, and he gets out. He's just super nice, light kid. he gets out there and he is just destroying kids. And I was, hoping that the NTDP would take him because he might kill someone in North Dakota high school if he stayed his junior and senior years. So he's going to bring a little bit of a different element back there on the back end. So definitely defense has been a strong suit under Brad Berry. And I would expect that to continue with some of the high-end kids they're bringing in.
Good stuff. Freddie?
Whether you're a broadcaster, multimedia, or journalist, it's all about relationships in terms of getting information, relationships with SIDs, with coaches, with ADs, with players. Give us a couple of your favorite players that you've dealt with. Don't have to be the star players, but a young man that, after knowing him for 3-4 years, you can say with confidence that regardless of where his athletic career takes him, this world's going to be a better place because of this young man.
Yeah, like one guy I remember when he was here, they had a goalie named Brad Eidsness, and he was a super, super sharp kid. And me and the sports info director where I was like, man, Brad Eidsness is going to be, he's going to do something. And sure enough, he signed a hockey deal, and he decided to retire from hockey after 1 year to go to law school, and now he's a lawyer up in Calgary. So that does not surprise me. He also very much enjoyed getting into discussions / arguments with some teammates about things. We loved listening to the Brett Hextall, Brad Eidsness discussions because they were two super smart kids that would talk about things that you don't hear other, college students talk about. They were very deep, and so that was kind of fun. Nick Matson played for UND, and he was always one of the smartest kids around. I still will text back and forth with Nick, usually about tennis or pickleball, because that's he's getting into racket sports now. UND had a defenseman named Jordan Schmaltz, who's subtly one of the funniest guys I've ever met. So those are some guys that I've enjoyed getting to know. Yeah.
How about coaches? I mean, not just the ones that you're, Hack and Brad and, Dean and all the coaches you've dealt with at North Dakota. It can be them, but I'm just curious, are there other coaches that you've dealt with, that you've covered, that just have left a lasting impression on you, Brad?
Yeah. For starters, the one thing I always enjoy telling people is Dave Haxtell. Everyone sees game day Dave Haxtell, right? Super intense on the bench, focused, dialed in. You catch Dave Haxtell on a Tuesday or in the summer, he's actually really, really funny. Great sense of humor. The guy just absolutely loves hockey. You can have a conversation with him about a bantam game, a high school game, USHL, North American League, American Hockey League, Europe, NHL. Like he just is someone who genuinely enjoys the sport. And I think a lot of fans I've talked to over the years, they would come up to me and be like, I met Dave Haxtell. He was nothing like I thought. I'm like, yeah. If you catch him on a game day, he is legit very, very intense, very focused, dialed, whatever. But he, away from game day, you would not expect the way he is. So that's something I always like telling people. Another guy I always really enjoyed covering was George Gwozdecki at Denver. Entertaining guy. I always had a different perspective on things, and I still remember even after he got thrown out of the game at Ralph Engelstad Arena for walking across the ice to talk to an official.
Classic. Tell it, man. It's a great story.
Oh yeah. Actually, I take that back. He got thrown out because he was standing on the dasher boards yelling at a referee. So the referee goes over by the penalty box. The captains are there, and he said, by the way, your coach is ejected. So I'm trying to remember who the captain was. It might have been Adrian Veerman at the time. he skates over to George and said, "Hey, he ejected you." And so George climbs over the bench, walks all the way across the ice. He talked to the AR for a bit and went back to I'd never seen that before. And he got ejected. Well, after the game, would love to talk to George, but no way the ejected coach is going to be around. Sure enough, he was standing outside the locker room and did an interview with us. And it was unbelievable. He said, "Where were you going, George?" And he said, because the penalty box was over on the other side. And he said, "Well, I was going to the locker room." And we said, "Well, your locker room is right behind the bench." And he said, "I was taking the long way." That was always fun. I think it was 2 years ago when North Dakota went out to Denver. I ended up grabbing lunch with George and interviewed him and did a story about what he's up to now and remembering some old times. And it was a blast to talk about it. So he's a guy I always enjoyed covering. But, like current coaches, a lot of them, what I find that's unique about college hockey is there's not intense media saturation. So a lot of these guys really like talking hockey with you. I always love talking to Andy Murray. I enjoyed talking to Rico Blasi at Miami, and so many of these guys are just, they're not getting the 300 phone calls a week to do media appearances. So they genuinely enjoy sitting there and chatting hockey. And I think that's something that's really unique to college hockey. In football and basketball, reporters can't pick up a phone and just dial a head coach and have a 20-minute conversation with them like you can in hockey. And I think that's pretty unique and special about the sport and something I've loved about covering it.
And I think college hockey coaches, too, appreciate someone like you, a journalist such as yourself, who takes the game seriously, has a passion for the game, because at the same time, they're dealing with a lot of young reporters, student newspaper reporters who, are doing hockey because football wasn't available. And give the coaches credit. It's part of their duty to educate these student reporters on the game. But still, when somebody like you phones and can talk nuances of the game, history, and stuff like that, that gets their attention because that's their life, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the media they do is very surface level. Like, how's your team going to be this year? Who's going to be the player? Where when you can talk and ask them about a third line guy and be curious about that, they really enjoy talking about it, and I enjoy hearing about it. Like there's so many good stories around college hockey that don't get told, and I think for me that's really fun, and I think I think you're right that the coaches do enjoy chatting, especially questions that they're not getting asked. Like if you were to call them up and just say, how's your team going to be this year? It's like, okay, same old stuff. But if you can really get into something interesting, I think that's more fun as a reporter, and I think coaches find that more entertaining.
So, Brad, I want to go back to you were talking about Hack. And so I first met him in the 2008 regional in Madison there. And I was the same way, man. I'm like, this dude is all business, man. I'd been around Bowman a little bit when I was a producer in Detroit. So I had a little, not to compare Hack to Bowman, but you know what I mean, just the outside perception. And the first time that I came to Grand Forks when the league started, Hackett knew I had never been to the Ralph. So, we met with him like Dave and Shereen and I do, and we come in and we were downtown at I believe it was the Italian joint downtown, and he came walking in and he was meeting Dane and Brad and to have dinner, and he goes, "Benny, what'd you think of the rink?" And I said, "Red was right." And he perked up when he heard me say Red was right. And I said, Freddie could attest to this. Before I came to North Dakota, my favorite barn to do games in was Yost. It's clearly North Dakota now. And I'm not saying that because we're talking to you. I'm just, there's nothing like it, man.
Yeah.
And he perked up, and I said, he told me it's the nicest building in the world, man. And yeah, I can attest fully to what you're saying. Obviously, you're around him. You were a lot more than me, but great dude. How about games, man, that stand out in your time? That one might be a tough one, but are there some that come to mind that are just front and center games that you'll never forget covering North Dakota hockey and college hockey?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple, and it's kind of funny you mentioned that we're starting to do a series here on some memorable events we've covered,
Good.
and one of them I just finished writing about was the 2012 WCHA Final Five semi. North
Okay.
Dakota at the X at the Final Five. It was unbelievable. You'd have 19,000 fans. Half of them would be in green, half of them in maroon and gold. The atmosphere was incredible. And this particular year, UND was fantastic the year before. They lost all these seniors. They had they lost 5 of their top 6 forwards, Fratt and Schrupp, Malone, Hextall, and Gregoire, all left after that year. Then this team just kept having setbacks. Like Grimaldi got hurt before the year started. Colton St. Clair was ineligible because his transcript got lost from his online high school. And then they had a guy get knocked out for the year every month of the season. And all of a sudden, by January, they had no scratches left. By February, they were playing with only 17 guys.
Wow.
And 4 of them were walk-ons. We're talking all 4 were freshman walk-ons. So senior walk-ons, you're like, okay, these guys, freshman, sophomore, probably not scheduled to play a lot. Junior, senior year, that's when you hope they can play. Well, now all of a sudden they have these freshman guys who they didn't think were going to play all year, playing 20 minutes a night because they had no other choice. And all of a sudden, at the end of the year, this team just started winning. And you're like, how are these guys winning? They won the Thursday night game at the Final Five. Then they play the Gophers in this game. And midway through the game, Minnesota's just crushing them. It was 3-0. Shots were 21-4. And you're okay. They finally ran out of steam. And Minnesota was the 1 seed. They were really good. And well, at the end of the second period, Derek Forbert scores to make it. Right before that, actually, there's an icing, and Dave Haxtell uses his timeout. So everyone calls this the timeout game, because right after the timeout, there was a shift in momentum like I have never seen in a hockey game before or after. Like I said, shots were 21-4. And then I think the shots ended at the rest of the game were 22-2 North Dakota. They scored 6 straight goals. They came back to win it with this hodgepodge of a lineup that you just don't understand how it's happening. So I'll never forget that game, and just the way it happened and the way it played out. And, Corbin Knight scored the 5th goal, and he was a guy who was so straightforward with his celebrations. He would barely raise his arms, whatever. And I remember he scored and he got down on a knee and fist pumped. And you're like, oh my gosh, even Corbin Knight is pumped right now. And one of the players told me after the game, Dave Haxtell, he said every post game he was so measured and he knew what his message was and he was so planned out. And he said he came in there and just threw up his arms and started. So he's like, even Haxtell in that moment couldn't help but celebrate just what had happened. And the next night they went and won the championship against Denver. So I'll never forget that one. And then my very first year on the beat, the other night I'll never forget is I covered the Holy Cross, Minnesota upset, which was followed by UND beating Michigan. And that is the loudest building I've ever been in my life. Of course, it was a perfect storm. Grand Forks hadn't hosted a regional in over 20 years. So already fans are going crazy about Grand Forks getting a regional. And then you put Minnesota, North Dakota, and Michigan in the same regional. And I mean, so we go to the game the first night. Minnesota's the 1 seed. They were unbelievable that year. They had Patalny, Ehrman, Phil Kessel, Goligoski. They were just loaded. And so everyone's like, if UND can beat Michigan, it's going to be North Dakota, Minnesota to go to the Frozen Four. Well, of course, we know what happened. Holy Cross ends up beating them. And when they scored that overtime goal, I mean, the roar and of course, of all for it to happen is Minnesota's biggest rival. So everyone there is just going crazy for Holy Cross. The largest crowd they played in front of that year was like 1,000 people. So these players had never experienced like 12,000 people just going crazy for them. And then UND came out, you know, right. Holy Cross won in overtime. So UND was sitting in the locker room waiting to go on, right? Like, so they're just, okay, now it's going to overtime. They got all their gear on and they're waiting. And the players tell the story that they're sitting underneath and all of a sudden there's just this thunderous roar. And they all look at each other like, no way, that did not just happen. And one of the players ran out of the locker room and peeked his head in and came back and was like, it did. Holy Cross got it. And UND came out and scored like twice in the opening 8 minutes, and Michigan just had no shot. I mean, the building was already as crazy of an atmosphere as you could think of, first regional in 20 years. And then all of a sudden you light that with, you know, you pour gasoline and light it with the Minnesota getting knocked out in the first round. And that, I mean, you know, I've seen a lot of different sporting events and nothing has been that loud in my life.
Freddie.
You know, Gopher fans in particular, Wisconsin, Minnesota, or Michigan and Michigan State to a lesser degree still lament college hockey's restructuring, 9 years ago or so. North Dakota, their fan base, all good with it as long as they've got good teams and can bring in quality opponents?
Yeah, and I think that what highlighted this for me was, yes, it's unfortunate that they lost rivalries like Minnesota and Wisconsin. It helps that they're playing Minnesota every year in non-conference, but it's not the same. It just isn't. The big thing I think that nobody realized at the time was that UND's schedule is fairly similar. They still play Duluth, Omaha, St. Cloud, Denver, CC. So there's 5 series, 10. That's 20 games of your schedule. As a whole, the schedule for UND doesn't look drastically different than it did when the leagues split up. And I think that was the biggest thing for UND. And I don't think anyone at UND realized it. You know, I think when the NCHC created, it's let's get as many big names as possible. I think it was let's try to get Notre Dame in our league because they're a big game. Let's try to get maybe a Boston school because they're big names. I think everyone underestimated remember St. Cloud wasn't a part of this league.
Right.
That was announced. And I think one underestimated how powerful names like St. Cloud and Duluth are for UND fans that have been seeing them play these teams for years. It's not necessarily the big names. You know, Ohio State's as big of an athletic department as there is in the United States of America. People are going to get more fired up to see UND play Duluth than they are Ohio State. You know, it's not necessarily the name when it comes to college hockey. And I think we've learned that through realignment.
Yeah. I know maybe 15, 20 years ago, it used to be a set of the blue bloods or so-called blue bloods in college hockey. They don't have to recruit, they just select. And that's probably not the case anymore, but maybe North Dakota is as close to any school that still applies to. Would you agree?
Yeah, they don't lose a ton of recruiting battles. They do lose some. I think one of the equalizing factors is that 20 years ago, you are selecting kids who are coming into campus in 6 to 8 months. Now, all of a sudden, maybe you still get your choice of the kid, but they're not coming in for 3-4 years, and a lot can happen developmental wise there. And all of a sudden, the kid that you thought was going to be the best kid isn't the best kid anymore. So I think that has played a little bit of a role in equalizing things across the country. But yeah, UND has been able to recruit a lot of its guys it's wanted. And the other thing is, I think it's had some success in picking out some guys maybe that, aren't super highly recruited. Like I know Ben watched a lot of Cole Smith over the last 4 years, and what a dominating force he was on both ends of the ice. And here's a kid that had no college offers when UND offered him, and he ended up being such a big player for this team. And so I think it's been a combination of, yes, they've been able to pick out some guys that everyone wants, and because they get to play in front of 12,000 people, they're going to get them. But they've also done a pretty nice job as a whole of finding the Cole Smiths, recruiting the Shane Pintos. When they got Shane Pinto, he wasn't super highly recruited. He had a couple offers. They got Jake Sanderson, who's going to be a top 10 pick. I asked Jake how many offers he had, and I'm expecting him to say 40. He's like, UND was my only offer when I committed. I'm like, what? Wow. Harvard, or there's another team out east. I think it was Harvard that was talking to him, but they've done a pretty good job of that too. But you're right that they definitely win a lot of recruiting battles for a lot of kids like playing in front of people and knowing that college hockey is number one here, not college football.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'd have a hard time saying no to her if I was ever in that situation. I can tell you that. So I gotta ask you something here, man. So what can we do to get this whole thing with this 3-on-3, man, just to go to 3-on-3? I mean, I'm being honest. Fred, I want to hear your response too. When I'm doing a game, when I'm doing a game, I don't care about the 5-on-5. I'm being dead straight. I just want the thing to go to 3-on-3, man. So I know you got a lot of knowledge of that. So I want to give us your thoughts and maybe what the process is or is going to be if that's to happen across the board, Brad.
Yeah, I think there's a good chance we'll see that. I think the rules, that's the number one topic on their list to debate here coming up. And I think it's less than a month now.
Okay.
And so I think there's a movement toward that. The NCHC teams are all backing that. I talked to Bob Motzko yesterday, and he said he gets the sense the Big Ten's on board with it too. So you got a couple leagues there. The challenge is getting the ECAC on board. I think they've been one of the holdouts there. So we'll see what happens. But I think there is something to do with that. And I think, like you said, I like how the NCHC gets to the 3-on-3, but it gets a little long, right? Like you go to the regulation, then 5-minute overtime, then 3-on-3, then maybe shootouts, and it's tough to explain all, well, this counts for national. Well, now the game is technically, someone scores in 3-on-3 overtime, and a fan's like, that was a great win. And I'm like, actually, they tied. And they're like, what? But they won. It's like, it's confusing. So I'd be curious. Fred thinks.
Freddie.
Well, there's an issue, a real issue with TV, as Brad just alluded to. You go regular 5-on-5 overtime, which I consider just, now you're making a 65-minute regulation game, basically. Then 3-on-3. So you've got 30 minutes on that ice, 30 minutes of play on that ice. So you're compromising ice conditions, and then you go to the shootout. And, I did games in the Big Ten last season that you're encroaching on close to a 3-hour game. I mean, it's getting baseball-like, and, the windows that TV have. Now, you go back 10 years and recalling the 3-on-3 discussions at the coaches' convention in Naples. And it was always I'm not going to call them lesser schools, but the schools that didn't think they had access to as much blue chip talent. That Minnesota and North Dakota, you go to 3-on-3, oh, what a huge advantage it is for them. And they would counter that by saying, Bob Daniels at Ferris State, he's got 6 good forwards or 5 good forwards and 3 good defensemen. That's all you need. Yeah. And and then you talk about the pairwise implications, and that 3-on-3 is different than 5-on-5, and you can't mess with the pairwise. It's a different game, and I agree with that to some degree, but if you're letting coaches make all those decisions, as I learned back in my CCHA days, you have to get the athletic directors on board, which I think the NCHC has done a great job of doing that. And you have to think, who are we serving here? Who's our product for? It's for the fans and for the TV. And when you start getting people thinking about that, then you've got a good shot. But you always have to look at the data, right? And how much would 3-on-3 or shootout standings differ from what would happen just 5-on-5? And I know when we did that in the CCHA going to the shootout, you can't have a shootout. We looked, I think, 3 or 4 years, and there would have been 1 year where 6th place flipped with 7th place. The impact really wasn't that great. So I'm all in favor of going 3-on-3 right away.
Yeah, I think you brought up several really.
Yeah.
I think number one, we have to remember it's entertainment, and college hockey. Actually, let's say all college sports are having some challenges drawing people to games. You need to do what you can to engage fans. I think that's a really good point. And I also have heard it's going to be really good for the teams that have the blue chip talent. Well, the 60 minutes of 5-on-5 also favors the teams with the blue chip talent, right? Like, is different, more pronounced. Which team in the NCHC had the best 3-on-3 record this year? It was Miami, who finished 7th.
Wow.
So Miami actually did much better 3-on-3 than they did 5-on-5.
Wow.
So I don't know if it's going to be that super pronounced that it's going to favor the top teams. And if it does, then, that's the nature of sports, right? Sports favors the better teams.
Yeah.
I think there's a good chance we'll see it, and I'm kind of excited to follow it.
I hate hearing that line. What's the matter with a tie? Well,
yeah. Well, nobody's doing it. It's antiquated. I mean, I remember 2 years ago when the rules committee came out and said that they were going to bar the 3-on-3s.
Yes.
Well, it's going to end after the 5-on-5. I just happened to be talking to a UND defenseman that day for another story, and I mentioned it to him, and he was like, he was really confused. He was like, what do you mean? Like, so what happens then? And I'm like, well, it just ends in the tie. He's like, he didn't understand. And I was like kind of taken aback by how confused this kid was. I'm like, how does he not understand this concept? And then I realized, wait a sec, this kid was 2 years old the last time there was a tie game in the NHL. He's never seen tie hockey games. And I'm like, wow, I didn't think about that. But yeah, this kid growing up has never seen a tie hockey game. So this concept is foreign to kids these days. Everyone else is doing it. And I hope college hockey decides to have some.
We need to
too, Freddie.
We just need to mention that that last tie NHL game, Brad Fast of Michigan State scored the goal that created that tie. His only NHL game and his only NHL goal.
Who were they playing?
Carolina, I forget who they were playing. He was playing for the Hurricanes.
I remember Brad. He's doing well now. From one Brad to another. We got a couple minutes left here, Brad. So what do we look forward to in your mind in the day we're living in? You mentioned something earlier, and it kind of triggered that thought in my head about, you're following up to Freddie there, engaging fans. Personally, I think it's going to be a nightmare going to games as a fan moving forward, at least in the short term. Love to hear your thoughts on what you think's, again, I know none of us know, but just love to hear your opinion on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the short term, it's a long shot that we're going to have. If we have fans at sporting events, before the new year, I will be pleasantly shocked. I don't see that happening right now. I'm hoping that sports can go forward in any way, you know, without fans. I mean, here's me staying up watching Korean baseball, so that tells you how sports deprived I am. I'm on board
No
with it.
tennis, man.
And there's not even tennis. It
Pickleball.
wasn't such a global thing. We could have tennis and soccer and all sorts of sports, but
He's a big tennis guy.
yeah,
I heard he's
so-
quite good too.
yeah, I've turned over to pickleball now. I'm full status officially. So
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you there. Go ahead, man.
yeah, no, I just hope that we can find a way to have a season. And if it's without fans, it's without fans. It's better than not having one. And we'll see. I saw Peter King asked Dr. Anthony Fauci this week about the timeline. And Fauci's response was that the virus will decide the timeline and our response to the virus. So even a guy like Anthony Fauci can't say for certain how this is going to play out. So time will tell. I hope we can get some sports going back. I hope I'm covering college hockey games in October. And if there are no fans there, so be it. It'll be better than you know, not having any college hockey and fans. You can sit at home and join the live chat with me and watch Ben and Dave on the TV.
Sounds good. Freddie, anything for you as we close with Brad?
That'll just be Brad after Ben's personal driver chauffeurs him the Grand Forks. He doesn't want to do that remote.
I'm getting an RV, man.
Oh, of course. Come on up. Everyone come on up here. You know, the Ralph is massive. If there's no fans, it's going to be easy to social distance. In so, and actually, you know what? The Ralph, remember the week everything got shut down, the Ralph was making preparations knowing the pandemic was an issue. So there are sanitation stations all over the Ralph. They're in the press box, in the locker rooms. Like, so I thought that was kind of interesting. So if there are games next year, even without fans, they already do have a lot of the infrastructure set up for trying to take as many precautions as possible.
Good to know, man.
Brad, thanks for your time. You know, it's great that you're kind of a throwback. Not many journalists left covering college hockey with a national perspective, and we always appreciate the work you do.
Well, I appreciate it. It's been fun, guys.
Yep, you too, Brad. Keep up the great work, man. I'll keep reading your stuff. You do the best in the business, man. So I appreciate you taking some time to join us. And good luck tonight with the Korean Baseball League, since there's no tennis.
Go Dinos.
Fred Schlossman from the Grand Forks Herald, and our guest here on this edition of No Holding Back. For Fred, Ben, we'll see you next time with an all-new edition.